Hey everyone, my name's Justin Allen. I've been a photographer for about a year and a half, but coming from the world of design, a lot of those principles transferred over and it made the transition a lot easier for me. I like to shoot all different kinds of photography, whether it be landscape or portrait or street photography. I like to do a lot of travel stuff. I travel a lot, so I'm always bringing my camera with me when I can. I think practicing in different facets of photography makes it a lot easier to adjust to any little changes or obstacles that may be in your way when it comes to shooting a certain subject that may be a paid shoot. I'm willing to experiment. I think that's when people kind of find what they like to do with photography, is when they just start messing around and having fun with it rather than putting too much pressure on themselves to create something that everybody else likes. Instead, they need to create things that they like. Two of my favorite photographers right now are, one, Ansel Adams, who did the national parks photos and is some of the best work I've ever seen in my life. And two would be Jason Kummerfeld, who goes by Grainy Days here on YouTube. To me, composition is what makes or breaks a photograph. And that's as far as professionally. If you're just pointing and shooting, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're doing it professionally, I highly suggest looking into composition. I started with rule of thirds, leading lines, the golden ratio. Golden ratio is a little bit more advanced, but it's easy to get too caught up in composition. And if you focus on one of those things, eventually you'll be like rule of thirds, rule of thirds, rule of thirds, and then move on to another one. I learned by repetition, so I would go out for a day and shoot rule of thirds, or for a week. I think I focused on rule of thirds for a week before I bounced over to, oh, let's do some leading lines. And then eventually, once you get down the basics of composition, you can start putting those things together to where you're like, oh, well, there's rule of thirds here, but here's some leading lines in the back. Practice one little bit and build it up. It's not a skill you learn all at once. It's something that has to be built over time, and the only way to keep that muscle memory and the knowledge in your head is to do it consistently and often. It's easy to want to jump ahead with photography, and sometimes that's not the way of doing it. Some people are just naturally good with a lens, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But if you're somebody who struggles with composition, I would highly suggest picking up your camera and going and shooting and focusing on one aspect of composition as well as you can. I'm going to be doing this exercise coming up soon where I carry a pocket camera with me everywhere instead of carrying around. I usually shoot with a Sony a7 III, and that's big, bulky, but you know it's going to get great quality. So I want to buy an older camera and with a lot less frills and a lot less options, and to see if I can focus more on my composition to create something in an older camera that doesn't have all of the settings and benefits that a Sony a7 III has. When I'm starting to compose a photograph, I tend to find a subject that I really enjoy, or that I think is just a little interesting, just something that piques my interest. I'll try to frame it somehow, whether it's, if let's say I'm in the forest, I shoot a lot of landscape stuff. So let's say I see a great looking mountain in the distance that I want to shoot. Instead of just pointing and shooting and get the misty look over the mountains and everything, what if I found a set of trees that could frame in the mountain in the shot, and it just adds another layer of depth to it. And it kind of reminds me of the way Disney used to draw their animations, like with Snow White, how they'd have the foreground, the midground, the background, and that way you could zoom through it and they'd shoot vertically through it. And I think that's the way I like to approach my photography, is to just build different layers and frames that can get you the depth and the composition that you want. I think the best advice to give any photographer who is trying to focus on their composition is to shoot as much as possible. You can watch a million YouTube videos, you can read 100 books, you can talk to a bunch of different photographers, and they're all going to give you different advice. But I think the best way to learn anything, and the best way I learn anything, is to approach it as a hands-on operation. Find a subject and do a 360 walk around that subject. Walk out from a distance and look back on the subject. It's not always as easy as point and shoot. Sometimes you have to work to get the composition you want. I understand, it's frustrating. Sometimes we live in a boring place. I live in Michigan, and right now everything out there is just brown, blue, and white. That's it. That's the only colors we have. And spring's starting to come, so the green's going to be coming, but right now it's just scrub brush and wasteland. And that doesn't make for an interesting composition unless you can build something on top of it. It's hard to get good at composition, and it's frustrating, and you're going to get mad at your camera. You're going to think you're no good. You're going to want to throw your camera across the room, but don't, because it's expensive. If you can put together a good shot, framed well, using the right proportions and the right lighting, your photo is already miles ahead of where a majority of people are at. Something I wish I would have learned earlier as a photographer is to just shoot what you enjoy. Don't worry about what everybody else thinks. Ask the opinions of some other people that you know and trust. Ask some strangers if they could give you some advice on what your photos are lacking. But at the end of the day, it's your photography. And if you believe in yourself and your abilities, you're going to be able to do it as long as you focus on the principles of photography. Don't stray from the basics. Get your exposure, your composition, and your lighting right, and you're unstoppable. Those are what make a great photographer.